Yeah, sounds good. My segment this week is titled Outrage Culture and the Reductionist Mindset, or excuse me, Reductionist Worldview. So there's this sort of this paradigm that I've been noticing as I pay attention, as I've been paying more and more attention to the news and just current events over the last maybe 2 or 3 years of my life. I'd never really put much stock in it before. I never really thought of myself as being political or even too much up on current events. So, but one of the things that I have noticed, one of the paradigms I have noticed as I have been paying attention to this and to current events, is that it seems that we're moving more and more towards an outrage culture. And what I mean by that is that we get bombarded with these sort of news articles, etc., on our social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, whatever platforms you might be on, and we see these. It pops up in our feed, and a lot of times, we have no control over what comes up in there. As we all know, Facebook, has some sort of a magic algorithm that thinks they know what you want to see, so they're going to show you the stuff basically that they decide is best for you. I mean, that's probably a topic of discussion for another time. But so what happens is when we see these articles, there are outrageous things. For example, the American Airlines incident that I just referred to under the strange in our previous segment, that's pretty outrageous. I mean, you think that this woman was almost hit by a stroller, or was hit by a stroller by a flight attendant as a passenger on the plane, and her child was almost hit. But the issue with it is it's that the information is usually given to us in sort of like a sound bite or video bite form. So we're only seeing the part of an incident that that is the most sensational. If I can use that phrase, I feel like the most sensational stuff is the stuff that's going to get the most, that companies feel is going to get the most clicks. So they're going to share that. They're going to share that aspect of it, and maybe not necessarily the full story. They may not be outright trying to deceive the public, but in that sense, we do see that people get outraged by this sort of thing, and in a lot of cases, rightfully so. I think that it's we all as human beings have a sense of justice, and some of us have maybe more of a sense of justice than others. Just when we see somebody who needs help, we go and help them. There's a guy on the corner that needs some cash. You might give him some cash to help him out, if you're so inclined. But the issue with it is that people have, and a lot of people have, different perspectives on things. So what happens is this outrage that gets displayed on the internet is almost becomes like a bit of showmanship in a way, because it's almost like people will sort of like posture in a way that hunters in the old days would posture. They would pose next to their kill with like their gun, like, hey, look what I did. So you're like showing off what you did, sort of like grandiose even. But in these cases, people are sort of like, saying they're saying how outraged they are by situations that arise around them. But then I feel like there's this paradigm where there's a lot of cases where nothing is done about it. Excuse me. So people are they're content to sit behind their computer screen or sit on their couch and say how terrible something is. But far and away, for most circumstances, most of us are not going to feel the urge to get up and do something about it. And that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly normal. If we went running after every cause or every single thing that irritated us, I think we'd be just all over the place.
But isn't that kind of what people are doing now? I'm sorry, not to interrupt, but isn't that kind of what people are already doing? Like, if you go, and there's a term that was coined a few years ago called slacktivism, because people hop on to whatever the latest issue is, and they advocate for, well, even without having the full facts on the information. A good example was the Invisible Children Project. I think it was the Invisible Children. No, it was. I'm sorry. They're good. If you haven't heard of them, they're good. But it was the Kony 2012 project. And Joseph Kony was a really, really bad dude. He was the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda and was known for like pillaging, small tribal villages, and would take the children and use them as child soldiers in his army to fight against the government. And so there was this this thing that kind of blossomed at the peak of Twitter, and there was this movement to try and find a way to help capture this guy who's wandering throughout the bush of Africa. And a lot of people got behind it. They didn't really know much about it. They didn't know much about they didn't even know who Joseph Kony was, because most people don't study Africa, And then it turns out that people were giving all this money, and this guy behind the project was wasting the money. He wasn't actually using it to help people.
Oh yeah, those African warlords. Yeah, and I had heard heard stories about that as well, where these guys would basically just, I mean, it's really sad, but they would do all kinds of, these warlords, these African warlords actually were literally practicing witchcraft, where they would, I know you're saying this particular guy used children as shields, and some other cases that I've heard, where they actually will sacrifice them and do different stuff beforehand as well. So they'll literally kill a child to gain power from it before they go into battle, believing that will make them invincible. Not to get off, I don't want to get into too much of a bunny trail with that. That is something that is very worth being outraged upon. So that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But I feel like in cases like that, like you're saying, it's on Twitter, where there was a lot of outrage. There's a lot of like tweeting back and forth. So you have people like just sort of shooting these tweets back and forth, angry tweets that are a lot of times just really vulgar and not very well thought out, and it just becomes sort of a storm of what, and it basically I feel like it kind of is self-defeating in a way, because what ends up happening is the real issue gets masked by these ridiculous arguments, this ridiculous outrage, to where people aren't, and the fact that they're willing to get into an argument like that shows that they're not necessarily caring so much about the issue itself, but that they really want to sort of promote their own agenda, if you will. So we've discussed previously where, the sort of in the political landscape, there's sort of like this division of two sides, two teams, essentially. That's sort of like the narrative that we see. But I feel like a lot of people, so say, for example, somebody on the left sees that, they're going to use it, on the left side uses that, they're going to use that to sort of like bump up their own worldview and say, see, this proves my point on this fact, this fact, this fact. And then somebody else on the other side, on the right side, is going to say the same thing, but with other examples. And then they end up getting into a political fight. And it doesn't do anyone any good to do that. So I feel like it is really a self-defeating thing with this outrage culture. And when we look at some of these YouTubers and stuff, that I call them SJWs, short for social justice warriors, sort of like this movement that's cropped up on YouTube in the last few years, where people just literally make videos and or where they just go out and protest, or they just try to make their point on their videos and argue with people, and it's usually just really, really ugly stuff. And it seems almost kind of a refreshing rarity when you do see someone that's sort of like trying to go about it the right way, if you will, where they're bringing their points in love rather than in just, I'm the right one, I don't want to hear your point, I just need to teach you what I've learned because I know so much. So I'm going to stop right there before I get into the reductionist worldview, and then just let's start the discussion here. What do you think about that? This sort of like outrage culture that I think is really detrimental to helping causes, real actual good causes.
Well, I think it's a bad thing, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that's the thing we should necessarily be focusing on in the long run, because it's not the cause, it's a symptom. And actually, I had a similar I mean, not the same topic, but I had a similar conversation with a friend of mine at work the other day. Um, and we we have a lot of people who go walk around the zoo or that I work at. I work at a zoo, in case you didn't know, and they'll take selfies and stuff like that with the animals or with, you know, just in front of other things. But I mean, we live in a selfie culture. Everyone's taking selfies of themselves, and we were both kind of questioning about whether or not that's good for, you know, for culture and good for society and good for, you know, the future of this country. You know, just like in very vague terms and kind of big picture things. But at the same time, I came to the conclusion that, like, it's a selfie is a selfie. Like, what, it's a picture. Who cares? But the point being is that it's the heart behind it, and it's not necessarily that a selfie is inherently bad. It's this arrogance and this pride that we're somehow more important and more valid than somebody else. And I think that translates into what you're talking about here, and that's why we have this outrage culture, because the reason I say it's a symptom and it's not a cause is because it's a symptom that's exacerbated by other symptoms within our culture and within our society. So, for instance, a few months back, probably about a year ago now, I wrote a post on my blog about what I called the Facebook effect, and it's you know, the way that the algorithms work and the way that advertising markets make it that Facebook wants you to keep coming back, and they want you to, and Twitter does the same thing, but you know, you click like or you retweet something, and that site is going to adapt that pattern into its algorithm to give you more relevant material to keep you coming back so you enjoy it. But over time, what happens is that you end up finding yourself in an echo chamber, essentially. And so you think that everyone is just like you, and you think that you're on the right side because so many people, all these people that you know, all the people that you see on the internet, they all agree with you. So as soon as you start seeing somebody on the other side, then automatically they're the enemy because they're on the other side, and they vehemently disagree with you because they're in the same boat, and they found themselves in another echo chamber that's saying the opposite of what you already think. And excuse me. And I think that I've yet to figure out what the underlying cause is and what the underlying problem is, aside from sin, really. That's kind of the broad answer that doesn't really answer the questions at large. I just think that the outrage culture, it's really annoying to me. And frankly, I ain't nobody got time for that. I'm not going to sit here and entertain someone who's just going to get outraged for the sake of being outraged. I'm just going to tell them to be quiet and move on, or, like, you know, facts don't care about your feelings kind of thing. It's just like here's the facts. If you can't handle that, go back to school, you know. But you know, this is the real world. This is how things work. Things are hard. Bad things happen to good people, and that's just kind of the way it is. But there, like you said, there are things that are valid to be outraged about, like when ISIS releases a video of them torturing somebody or killing somebody. There's cause for outrage for that. When we see atrocities happening, there's a good reason to be outraged by that. But at the same time, not everything needs to be, you know, an outrage. Like, for instance, I'm not going to try and give too many details, but, you know, a woman that I know was called a racist by another woman, and it was an African American woman who was calling a white woman racist. And the woman that I know, she pulls out her phone and unlocks it and shows a picture, and she says, "Ma'am, this is my husband," and she married a young black man. And I'm like, not everything is warranted to be an outrage. You know, not everything is a personal attack. And I think that's part of the problem, is that this outrage culture is based on this idea that if you don't agree with me, you're my enemy. And if you're my enemy, anything that you say that's not in line with what I think and what I believe, you're automatically attacking me based on my my beliefs or my views. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And you really hit the nail on the head of what I was trying to say. And I think that that selfie analogy was really perfect for what I'm trying to say, because that's also social media. And what is a selfie when you think about it? What it's all about is a selfie is all about, you know, posturing and looking good and making yourself look as good as possible. But there's really no substance behind it. So I mean, we see that with people who post a lot of pictures about their life and they put it on social media. I've never been a person to do that, and I'm not criticizing people who do that either. But we do see that, a lot of times people end up looking at those type of persons social media, and they're kind of jealous. They're like, man, I wish I had such a cool life as them. But really, they're not doing anything different than any of us, and they're just sharing images of it. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there's not really any substance behind a lot of this outrage that we see. So if there's a real cause and you're really outraged about it and you want to put your money where your mouth is, that's one thing. But if you're just going to be a troll essentially and get on the internet and hide behind your net handle or wherever you're gonna share your information from, and just troll people and needlessly cause arguments and spread division, then that is not something that is good. I mean, we read in the Bible, Jesus was clear. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He said that on the Sermon on the Mount. That was one of the 10, was it 8 or 10 Beatitudes? And that is such a truism right there, because when you are somebody who's constantly looking for or constantly sowing division, that's what you're going to find everywhere. You're going to see it everywhere you go, and it's going to crop up everywhere you go, and you're just going to lead a miserable life, because you're always going to be angry at the people around you because they don't share your ideals on one particular subject or another. Inevitably, I mean, Dan, you and I, we're brother-in-laws, but there's subjects we don't agree on. If we ended up getting angry at each other for every subject we didn't agree with each other on perfectly, and we do agree on a lot of stuff, but we also disagree on stuff, then our relationship would just not be very good. So I guess the point I really want to try and get across to our audience here is, we need to be peacemakers. We need to come against this outrage culture and not come against it with more outrage. It's not good for us to come out and be outraged at the outragers, essentially. You know what I mean? Like, I'm outraged that you're outraged. I'm outraged that you're outraged that I'm outraged. It just feeds on itself. But rather come in love and building people up as much as possible. I mean, sometimes there's situations and firmness is needed. But I really think that's a key to us moving forward as a society and not allowing ourselves to be divided. What do you think about that, Dan?
Yeah, and before we move off this topic onto the next one, just a thought on that too. You mentioned I think what you said was push back to push back, but to, I can't remember what you said. I'm sorry. You said something about in love, like to stand up in love or something like that.
I think just stand up in love, and just approach them in love. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I agree with that. But there are also times where we, for instance, we may disagree. Like we may disagree vehemently, not necessarily you and I, or even you and I, but I'm a constitutional libertarian. I'm not going to agree with the communists. It's just not going to happen. And so, for instance, just using that as an example, there's a way to disagree civilly. There's a way to disagree without outrage having to be a part of the conversation. But there are times when people say and do things where, and they could be good people. They could just be good friends of yours who have a different opinion, but they take an extremist view of things. And towards, is it necessarily unloving to push back more firmly than someone might be comfortable with just because it makes them uncomfortable? For instance, I'm not going to try to give an example because it's someone else's personal example. I'm not going to use that, but they believe it, they're happy with it, but that's not something that, according to what they espouse, that's not something that is appropriate. So I guess you could liken it to church discipline would be the best thing I could think of. When for those of you who aren't Christians, we have this thing in Christianity called church discipline, where if somebody is a believer in Jesus Christ as Messiah, that if they're doing something in sin, that it's the responsibility of their other Christians around them, brothers and sisters in Christ, as we call them, to come alongside them and to help correct their behavior, and help them to change their thinking on it. And some people would say that's like brainwashing or whatever, but they missed the point, because it's supposed to be in love. As a family, as you would go to a brother or sister family, if they were doing something wrong or destructive to themselves or others. I totally lost my train of thought of where we were going with that. I guess the point being that I don't necessarily think that it's unloving. It might not necessarily come out as kind, but it's not unloving to to push back firmly when somebody's clearly doing something wrong or something that's destructive, even if they think that they have the best intentions behind it.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I think that within like social circles where you're friends with people, that's where we have to use discretion. We need to use wisdom in how we would, if we would approach a friend. Some issues they do need, where it's like, if it is another Christian brother, so to speak, then yeah, and there's an issue of Christianity, then yeah, possibly you would approach them. But if it's something where they like a political candidate where you don't like them, then I think that's a different story. And the other thing that we need to remember too is, outside of those social circles, now I'm referring to the public domain where we are right now, actually on doing our video podcast. When you're in the public domain, it is important to stand for your beliefs, and you will be persecuted for your beliefs, whether you're Christian or not. So we see that all the time with people on both ends of the spectrum, where there's persecution coming from the other side, where there's arguments being thrown at people from the other side, and that essentially is persecution. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, whenever we do take a stand as Christians or on any other subject, whether it be political or anything like that, there will be pushback, and it's up to us to decide how to respond to that pushback. In the circumstance of a public figure being attacked, there's a lot of different ways to do it as well. But I think the best way to do it is to look at the example of Jesus Christ and in the scriptures, and he was constantly attacked by the Pharisees. So the political rulers at that time attacked Jesus, and were constantly trying to trap him and ask questions that would get him to essentially become mired in a legal dispute. And they would try to do that, but he was able to take a stand, and he was able to speak to them in love in most circumstances. There were circumstances where there were other methods that were used, but this is that's the Son of God we're talking about. So I'm not gonna. I mean, we're not gonna go through somebody's workplace with a whip and start throwing their tables over, etc. And I'm referring to the table. That would be fun. Although that would be fun to do with that if there were no consequences. But the point I'm trying to make is, we need to, everything that we need to do when we're interacting with other people, I firmly believe that it needs to be done in love, or love needs to be at the forefront of our thinking process. Like,
right.
Especially if it's with friends, I mean, how is this going to affect this person? I want to make sure that I come at them in love, but also be firm at the same time. And when I'm saying come at them in love, I'm not saying like, okay, you're right, don't worry about it, let's just forget this. But there are ways of handling and every situation is different, but there are ways of handling situations where it doesn't have to turn into sort of a fist fight of words, if you will.
Right, and I agree with that. I think that in all these things, I think that's the point we're getting to on this as well. But and just a reminder, I know that not everybody's been watching since episode 1. I know that not everyone who watches this is a Christian. So if you don't really like the references to Jesus and all that, the way we're talking about them, just so you're aware, we are Christians, and if you don't like it, sorry, you're welcome to join in the conversation, and we can have a talk about it too. And We like to hear your perspectives as well. But we're pressing on time, so let's go ahead and move on to your second point.